Hello. The title of Florence Price's piece says it all. Ethiopia's shadow in America. Not Ethiopia's legacy, not America's roots in Ethiopia, but the shadow. At the time Florence Price wrote this piece in 1932, as a black American writer and a woman, she'd encountered a fair amount of prejudice, not maybe as much as some people of her race might have done. She'd come from a fairly prosperous family in the Deep South, and her talent had been recognised and encouraged, despite the double disadvantage of being a black woman. But by the time she wrote this piece in the 20s, when she herself was in her 30s, the family had experienced an increase in racial violence in the southern states of America where they lived, and they'd actually been forced to move to Chicago in the north, where things were relatively safe. This piece, though, if Florence Price felt any rage or anger, she certainly doesn't show it in this music. It's a warm, gentle pastoral with some beautiful use of black American spiritual music, of her own composition, I think, in the central movement of the three movements. And it's very much in the kind of the spirit of the great 19th century Czech nationalist composer Antonín Dvořák. That's highly significant. Dvořák had spent a couple of years as the founding father and director of the New York Conservatoire of Music in the Dvořák had spent a couple of years as the founding director of the New York Conservatory of Music in the early 1890s. There, he'd published an essay in which he claimed that the roots of America's future classical national style could be found in its indigenous peoples, not its indigenous white peoples, he mentioned, but the black Americans and the Native Americans. This caused a furore at the time, but when his New World Symphony, which embodies these principles in music, was heard for the first time in 1894, it was a colossal success, a kind of manifesto laying out the grounds on which a future American classical music could develop. And develop it did, in all sorts of fascinating different ways. You can say, for instance, that the great jazz composers like Miles Davis or John Coltrane are as rooted in Dvořák's music as Aaron Copland, or indeed Florence Price. But Florence Price seems closest in ways, in spirit, to Dvořák, that kind of gentle, warm pastoralism, the love of folk music and the sense it can give of a place, the spirit of a place, as well as just a bit of local colour. I think Dvořák would have been impressed with this piece, and I think he would have regarded it as a really worthy follower of his own pioneering example. It is a really lovely, appealing piece. And it's quite extraordinary to think that it had, although it actually the score did meet with approval in 1932, that its first performance wasn't until, wait for it, 2015. Well, at least we've heard it now. And if Florence Price wasn't able to live to see it successful, it certainly has been successful in our time. Samuel Barber's Violin Concerto was much luckier in that it did get a performance almost immediately after a composer had finished it, and it very quickly became an international success. And it's now one of the most popular violin concertos in the repertory. But its birth wasn't easy. For a start, it was written for a young American violinist called Iso Briselli. The story for years was that Briselli really didn't like it, and he certainly didn't give the first performance, and that this had caused Barber a lot of heartache. But it turns out that Briselli wasn't the problem. It was his pupil. It was his teacher, a gentleman by the name of Albert Meif, who really took exception to the piece and complained about absolutely everything to do with it, from its spirit to its violin writing to the character of the four movements. It lacked backbone as a whole, he claimed. I hope he was suitably shamed by the work's success at its first performance and afterwards. But it is a remarkable piece in many ways, not just because it really embodies the spirit of the violin, the violin as singer, the violin as the great singing instrument of the orchestra in the first two movements, and then as the great athlete in the remarkable moto perpetuo finale. That moto perpetuo means perpetual motion, and that's the impression it really gives, that it's buzzing with energy and crackling and moving along all the time in rapid figuration. It's very difficult for the violin too. There's also maybe a little bit of a sense of the feeling of the time about this. Barber wrote it in Switzerland, or he wrote the first two movements in Switzerland in 1939. And increasingly he was aware that things across the border, the borders in Germany and Austria, were getting worse and worse. And maybe something of that feeling can be made out increasingly in the first two movements. You can really sense the shadows lengthening, lyrical as the movement is. But there's also something about the finale that suggests that old Italian dance, the tarantella, which was supposed to dance away the effects of the bite of the poisonous spider, as though Barber has decided that he's going to dance away and disperse, or at least defy, the spirit of the times in dance music in the finale of his concerto. Well, it certainly went down very well at its performances right in the middle of the war. So he said maybe he did catch something of the mood of the time, and it's gone on being popular ever since. Finally, the great revolutionary symphony, Beethoven's Eroica. Well, perhaps it's the great revolutionary piece of music. Beethoven, at one stage, thought of dedicating it to the French revolutionary hero Napoleon Bonaparte, but his feelings about Bonaparte seem to have wavered a bit. And he was certainly very displeased indeed when he heard that Bonaparte had had himself proclaimed emperor in the presence of the Pope, no less. This wasn't what he had in mind for his great democratic hero at all. So Beethoven, according to legend, well, in fact, not just according to legend, you can actually see it on the manuscript, scraped out the dedication to Napoleon and called it a symphony, heroic symphony in memory of a great man. Really very, very significant change that, isn't it? But even so, there's something rather interesting in that this symphony that was supposed to be dedicated to Napoleon contains at its heart a magnificent funeral march with an outpouring of grief that's remarkable in music and unprecedented in music, I think, up to this stage. What Napoleon would have made of that, it's interesting to think. And really, in a way, the Napoleon Association, well, it's interesting historically, but in a sense, the music's engagement with the whole idea of heroism goes way beyond that. There is the aspiration in the first movement, the tragedy in the second, and then in the third, and particularly the fourth movement, the sense of something reborn, a new kind of hope. Music that for Beethoven was associated with the classical hero Prometheus, the half-man, half-god who defied the gods in order to help humanity, to give them fire, to give them education and art. And maybe that's what the symphony is saying, that in the end, art can show us a way to a better kind of heroism, can point another way towards a democratic, better, fairer world. Whatever. Well, maybe the heroism isn't the heroism of going out into the world and fighting for all the military fanfares and everything. Maybe it's a deeper, more inward heroism, that the kind of heroism that was required of Beethoven in his later years when his political ideals were crushed, his hopes of finding a wife were crushed, and he found himself increasingly isolated from the world by his terrible deafness, the strength he needed to go on. Maybe we can hear that in this symphony too. However you choose to hear it, it is one of the most exciting pieces of music in the whole classical repertory. And if anyone were to ask me to play them just one symphony, somebody who knew nothing of classical music, that really embodied what the symphony was all about, I think I'd choose this one. It's kind of, well, it's just about perfect.